The road into the village was narrow and weeping with old rain. Mud sucked at the soles of Miriam's boots as she stepped through the ruts, dragging her heavy skirts out of puddles with numb hands. Her shoulders stooped beneath the weight of a small satchel and a box pressed tight to her ribs, its corners softened from years of being carried, unopened, across cities and countries and back again. She hadn't thought she would return. Not really. She had whispered to herself once. Maybe, if things grew too hard, too hollow, too gray. And now that she was here, it felt like stepping into the past through a doorway that hadn't been locked properly. The village looked the same, but smaller, worn thinner. The stone fences were chipped, the hedges wild with thorns, the chapel bell tower crooked, like an old man's back. Her breath rose in the sharp autumn air, a ghost trailing her through streets that did not greet her. No one came out to meet her, but that didn't surprise her. Miriam had left years ago with a suitcase and a husband older than she was ready for, and the town had let her go without protest. She'd been the girl with the pale face and the empty cradle, the one who couldn't give her parents a grandchild, the one who buried her baby before its name had been written down. Then she married a stranger from the southern borderlands, a man with dry hands and a quiet voice who had given her a kind house and nothing more. When he died, some fever that took him quick, not cruel, she did not weep. She watched the smoke from his cremation rise into the air and realized she had nothing to stay for, and nowhere to go but back to the place that had first shaped her into silence. The cottage stood at the edge of the village where the grass grew long and the wind didn't bother with softness. Ivy had crawled over the windows, pressing leaves like hungry hands against the glass. The wood of the door had gone soft at the bottom, and when she turned the rusted key, the sound it made echoed inside her chest like the echo of a name half remembered. Inside, it smelled of dust and old apples, the remnants of harvest stored and forgotten. She did not light a fire. She sat on the stool beside the hearth, the same stool her mother had sat on when she snapped peas into a bowl, and she placed the box on her knees as if it were a child. The box was wooden, walnut dark, fitted with a brass latch that had never quite closed. Elias had carved it for her in their second year of marriage, when she had told him once in passing that she wished she had something to keep her letters in. There were only 3 things inside. A letter she had never opened, addressed in a hand she did not recognize, but it kept anyway, because it arrived on the day her daughter died. 2 rose petals, pressed flat and brown with time, stolen from the wreath her mother had worn in her hair the morning of Miriam's wedding. And a single, tiny shoe, knitted of cream wool, no larger than her thumb. It had been made by her aunt during the final weeks of Miriam's pregnancy, with small glass beads sewn into the toe to make it rattle. There had been 2 once. The other was buried with the baby in the churchyard on the western hill, in a grave so small the gravedigger had used only half his usual tools. Miriam didn't cry. She hadn't in years. It was as if something inside her had dried up after the child was born silent and blue, her lungs stubbornly still, her hands curled into fists like she already knew the world would not be kind. Elias had not touched her after that, not in anger, not in affection, just a polite absence between them, as if there were 2 actors continuing a play whose script had lost its final act. When he died, he left her the house and the orchard and a drawer full of ledgers that she didn't know how to read. She had sold it all to a man who needed land, taken the money, and bought the ticket north. She stayed in the cottage until the light outside turned blue. Then, without knowing why, she wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifted the box, and stepped back outside into the wind. The square was empty as she walked down the stone path, past shuttered windows and crooked lanterns. At the center of the square, as always, stood the old fountain. Its basin was cracked, and moss fanned out like green lace beneath the lip of the stone, but the water still flowed. It had never stopped, not even the driest years, not even when the church roof caved in or when fire took the grain barn. It was fed from an underground spring, people said, deep and hidden and older than the village itself. She sat on the fountain's edge and placed the box beside her. The water whispered quietly against the stone. Somewhere behind her, a dog barked once, and then nothing. Miriam closed her eyes and tried to feel something. Anything. But all she felt was the ache in her lower back and the hollow behind her ribs. The night air tasted like wood smoke and iron. She leaned forward and looked into the water, hoping for nothing, expecting less. Her reflection stared back at her, gray at the temples now, skin lined around the mouth in a way that hadn't been there when she left. The kind of face that people no longer looked at twice. "I'm still here," she said aloud, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. Maybe the water. Maybe her daughter. Maybe the version of herself she had left behind the night her body bled too early and too long, and the cradle stayed empty. The wind lifted a strand of her hair and brushed it across her cheek like a finger. She closed her eyes again and waited. The village bell tolled once in the church tower, dull and distant. She counted each echo until they faded. And then, as the silence settled again, she whispered the name she had never said aloud since that night, the name she had chosen before the birth, folded into her like a soft prayer. Annalise. It broke from her lips like a breath held too long. A name that never reached the birth records, never got stitched into a christening cloth, never passed between friends at the market. She said it once, and then again, quieter, and as she did, the wind shifted, the water in the fountain rippled. She waited for the grief to come, for the wrenching weight of it, but what came instead was a stillness, a kind of mercy, not forgiveness, not peace, but the sense that the world had paused just for a heartbeat to listen. She stayed there until the stars came out. She sat on the edge of the old stone basin, legs stiff, fingers curled against the roughness of the rim, and for the first time in years, she did not feel the need to leave or to distract herself or to imagine some other life. She simply sat, watched the dark water shimmer, and let her daughter's name linger in the air like mist. Behind her, windows stayed closed. The village turned inward, as it always had. But the fountain murmured on, tireless and ancient, and Miriam remained by its side, cradling the box against her chest like a heartbeat long buried. The first light of morning crept over the hills in a hush of pale gold, catching in the frost that silvered the grass and clung to the thatched rooftops like a breath held over the village. Miriam rose early, before the frost began to melt, her hands stiff from the cold and the sleep that never truly came. Her bones felt older than the hours she had slept, her limbs sluggish with the weight of memory and the ache of a body long used to silence. She boiled water on the stove, holding her fingers over the small blue flame, not for warmth but for proof that she was still solid, still here, still living in a world that could feel heat. The window above the sink was fogged with breath and cold air, and through it she could see the thin spire of the chapel, the heavy stones of the square, and the old fountain standing at its center, unmovable, unchanged. It was that unchangingness that drew her back outside. Miriam wrapped her shawl tight and walked the same path as the night before, boots pressing half-frozen prints into the damp earth. The village stirred in slow, unseen ways. Smoke rising from a chimney or two, a door creaking open and then shut again, hens scratching quietly behind a slat fence. No one spoke to her. No one greeted her. She didn't mind. In truth, it felt almost right. She didn't want words. She only wanted the sound of water. It was something to hold on to. As she turned the corner into the square, the early light struck the stone of the fountain at an angle that made the water shimmer like beaten metal. A bird lifted from its rim and vanished into the sky. She hesitated a moment, her fingers tightening around the handle of the shawl drawn across her chest, and then stepped forward. The fountain, even in daylight, had a kind of hush around it, an air of listening, as if it remembered every name ever spoken beside it and was waiting for more. She stepped up to the edge, ran her fingers over the smooth lip of the basin, and looked down into the water. That was when she heard it, a gurgle, faint at first, as if a stone had shifted downstream, or as if an animal were stirring beneath the surface. She straightened. The sound came again, louder this time, a low, burbling mixed with something else, something wet and soft and unplaceable. She leaned over the basin, her eyes scanning the water's slow rotation. At first she saw only the familiar patterns of current and leaf and reflected sky. And then, there in the curve where the water bent inwards toward the far edge, she saw a bundle. It came slowly, turning with the current in a gentle spiral, caught in the lazy drift of the spring-fed stream that fed the fountain. It looked like cloth at first, maybe someone's laundry swept away, maybe a sack of rags discarded upstream. But as it came closer, The shape shifted, and something inside Miriam's chest stilled. The bundle bumped gently against the rim of the basin and came to rest against a mossy stone. She stepped forward, one hand half raised, unsure she should touch it, unsure if it was even real. The cloth was reed-wrapped and wet through, but carefully wound, almost cradling. The reeds were tied with twine, as if someone had meant for it to float, not to drown. Her breath caught. She knelt slowly, hands trembling now, and reached into the water. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She slipped her fingers beneath the bundle and lifted it, water streaming from its corners, the reeds crackling softly under her grip. And then she heard the sound again, not from the fountain, but from the bundle itself. A cry, thin, weak, but unmistakable. It was a child, a baby. Miriam's knees gave out beneath her, and she sank to the stones beside the fountain, cradling the bundle against her body, her hands moving without thought, unwinding the layers of soaked fabric with slow urgency. Her breath came in short gasps, not of panic, but of disbelief. Inside the wrapping was a newborn girl, her skin flushed but not blue, her eyes open and startlingly wide for a baby so young. Her lips moved in a shape that could become a wail, but did not. Instead, she made a soft sound more like a question than a cry. The cloth inside was dry near the center, proof it had been wrapped with care, with foresight. Someone had meant for this baby to survive. Around the tiny wrist, tied with simple twine, was a silver ring no larger than Miriam's fingernail. It gleamed in the early sun, delicate and worn, etched with marks too small to read in the light. Miriam stared at it for a long time, her fingers hovering over it, afraid to touch, afraid of what it might mean. She looked down into the child's face again and felt a kind of stillness rise inside her, not peace, not quite, but clarity so sudden and complete that it stole the breath from her lungs. The baby blinked slowly, as if seeing her for the first time, and then, without sound or struggle, closed her eyes and rested against Miriam's breast as if she had always belonged there. Something inside Miriam broke open. She didn't cry out. The tears came slow, silent, slipping down her cheeks like the first thaw of spring. She held the baby tighter, her body curling instinctively to shield her from the wind, from the cold, from everything that could steal breath away. Her mind should have been racing with questions. Where had the child come from? Who had wrapped her? Why had she been sent down the stream like something between a secret and a blessing? But none of those thoughts reached her. There was only the weight of the baby in her arms and the warmth of that small body against the hollow she had carried for years. The fountain murmured behind her. The village remained unaware, untouched by the moment that was unspooling in its forgotten square. Miriam sat there for a long time, unmoving, as the sun climbed higher and the frost began to melt. She did not go to the church. She did not seek out the midwife or the priest. She did not call for help. Her world had narrowed to the span of a heartbeat, the curve of a cheek, the pulse of life in a body so fragile and whole. Eventually, when the sun had lifted the mist and the stones beneath her began to warm, she rose. She held the baby close and walked back to the cottage, not rushing, not hiding, simply moving as if the child had always been hers. No one stopped her. A curtain twitched in one window. A man paused with his ox car on the road and watched her pass, his mouth slightly open, but he said nothing. The village had learned long ago not to ask too many questions of grief, or of miracles. Inside the cottage, she laid the child on her bed, carefully removing the wet cloth, drying her with the edge of her shawl. The child did not fuss. Her eyes opened once and closed again, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady purpose. Miriam wrapped her in a length of flannel torn from an old nightdress and stood staring for a long time. The small fire crackled weakly in the hearth. Dust floated in the beams of morning light. And in the middle of the room, the bed where her mother had died, where she herself had been born, now cradled a stranger's child. Or maybe not a stranger at all. She did not know what to do, but her body did. It moved with an ancient rhythm, one deeper than thought, more honest than reason. She prepared warm water. She steeped herbs for colic, remembering from some place in her bones what had been taught to her once, long ago, She placed a silver ring on the mantelpiece, not to hide it, but to keep it in sight. When the baby woke again, hungry and searching, Miriam's body remembered something even deeper. There had been no milk for Annalise, born still, but now her breasts ached. She unfastened her blouse with trembling fingers, pressed the baby close, and waited. The child latched. Miriam gasped, both in pain and astonishment, and then bent her head over the tiny, perfect face. Tears came again, not as flood but as tremor, small and endless. She did not ask whose child it was. She did not plan what would come next. She only whispered, "You're safe now," again and again, until the words became breath, became rhythm, became lullaby. The child drank. The wind outside moved through the chimney, like a song. And Miriam, who had buried one daughter and spoken no name for years, held the baby close and began to believe, against all reason, that she had been chosen not as a mother again, but as something older, something deeper, a keeper, a witness, a second beginning. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and ancient, as though Miriam had stepped into a life she had once rehearsed in dreams but never been allowed to live. The cottage, long still and smelling of dust and disuse, began to take on a softness again. Not because anything had changed outwardly, but because the very air seemed to shift in the presence of the child. The baby slept often, her small body wrapped in flannel, and nested in a basket lined with the wool of Miriam's old petticoat. She cried in short, sharp bursts and then returned to silence, as if cautious not to ask too much. Miriam moved around her with quiet awe, her body remembering every motion of care it had never been allowed to use before. The kettle was always warm. The hearthfire never went out. Her hands, once idle and pale, grew red with work, scrubbing linens, steeping herbs, darning the edges of worn cloth into makeshift diapers. There was no plan, only motion, only instinct, only the pulse of something awakening in her, fierce and fragile all at once. By the third morning, she realized she would need milk, not for lack of trying. Her own had begun to come, to her astonishment and confusion, as if her body had kept some small, waiting part of itself dormant for just this moment. But it was not yet enough. She had no cow, no goat, and no coin to purchase either. The coins from Elias's estate had long since gone to man who bought their orchard. What loot she had brought with her was not meant for survival. It was keepsake money, goodbye money, meant to buy time, not sustenance. She stared at the small purse for nearly an hour before opening it. There were 5 coins left. She tucked 2 into her apron and set out toward the market road. The child swaddled close to her chest in a sling fashioned from an old curtain. The market stood at the edge of the village, little more than a crooked collection of stalls and barrows. Most days it was half empty, the vendors more likely to be neighbors than merchants. When she arrived, the baker was setting out his loaves, the cheese woman slicing rounds into wax paper. Miriam nodded once, but said nothing. Faces turned to watch her. The old ones who remembered her from before the baby, before Elias, before she left, looked at her with guarded curiosity. The younger ones, who only knew stories and names whispered between mothers, stared openly, their eyes darting between her face and the small bundle at her breast. She kept her gaze low, approaching the stall where jars of goat milk were lined in a row, cool and beaded with condensation. The vendor, a soft-voiced girl with straw-colored hair, looked up and paused, her hand stilling on the scale. Miriam did not speak at first. She simply placed 1 coin on the counter. The girl glanced at the child, then at Miriam's face, and seemed to understand. Without a word, she handed her a bottle, wrapped it in cloth, and nodded once. Miriam nodded back, then turned and left. She did not stop to barter or ask for anything else. That one kindness had been more than she expected, and more than she would forget. Back in the cottage, she warmed the milk in a small tin and fed the child by spoon. The baby drank slowly, her dark eyes fixed on Miriam's face, unblinking. She had not yet named her. She did not know why. Names had always felt like promises, and Miriam had once broken the only one she had ever made, to keep a child safe. But as she fed the girl, as she watched her fingers curl in the air like soft petals, a name began to rise in her mind without bidding. simple and whole. Clara, there was no memory attached to it. No family tie. Just the shape of it on her tongue, the roundness of it, the way it sounded like both clarity and comfort. She did not speak it aloud just yet, but that evening, she stitched it into the hem of a small square cloth, just to see how it looked. In the days that followed, Clara grew stronger. Her cries became fuller, her limbs more restless. She began to coo, to gurgle softly, her mouth forming shapes that had no meaning, but carried a kind of music. Miriam began to hum as she moved through the house, low songs without words, lullabies remembered from her mother's voice, from a time before grief had made silence a habit. She found old scraps of linen and cotton in her mother's sewing basket, faded dresses and curtains long forgotten, and began to cut them into squares. With each evening, the quilt grew, pieced together by firelight. It was not beautiful, but it was warm. She tucked it around Clara each night, her fingers smoothing the patch that bore the stitch name, though still she had not spoken aloud. News traveled slowly in the village, not through voices but through looks. Miriam began to feel it, not in confrontation, but in the shape of glances that lingered too long, the silence that followed her footsteps. At the bakery, the loaves grew smaller. At the well, the women paused in their gossip when she approached, but none dared to ask. The child had come to her by the water. That much was true, and the fountain was older than law, older than judgment. Still, the questions hung in the air like the scent of smoke. On the 5th day, she saw the old midwife watching from the edge of the square. Bet stood wrapped in a dark shawl, her eyes sharp beneath her lined brow. She had been the one to deliver Miriam's first child. She had been the one who said nothing as they buried the baby without name or song. Now, she said nothing again, but her gaze followed Miriam all the way to the cottage door. That night, Clara fussed until dawn. Miriam carried her back and forth across the creaking floorboards, her arms aching, her hair damp with sweat. At one point, she sat beside the hearth and cried without noise. The child pressed her chest, their breaths rising and falling out of sync. She whispered the name then, for the first time, in the dark where no one could hear. Clara. The child stilled, her tiny fist unfurling against Miriam's collarbone. Clara, she repeated, firmer now. The words settled into the room like dust, claiming its place. The next morning, Bet knocked at the door without warning. Miriam opened it, startled, holding Clara in one arm. The old woman did not ask permission to enter. She stepped inside, looked once at the child, and then began unwrapping the bundle she carried. Herbs, cloths, a wooden spoon. She set them down without speaking and examined the baby with practiced hands. Clara did not cry. Bet's fingers were cold, but her touch was careful. When she was done, she stepped back and nodded once. She is well, she said, her voice low and rasped by age. For now. Miriam said nothing, unsure whether this was blessing or warning. Bet's gaze drifted to the mantel, where the silver ring still lay. Her eyes narrowed, but she did not touch it. Instead, she turned back toward the child. Some things a river keeps, she said, almost absently, but sometimes it gives back what it never took. Then she gathered her things and left without another word. Miriam sat for a long time after that, holding Clara close, staring at the fire. The words echoed in her chest like a bell struck softly once. She thought of Annalise, buried without a ring, without a name, without a cradle. She thought of the river and the fountain, the way the water had taken and now returned. She did not know if it was mercy or mockery, but either way, Clara was here. From then on, she no longer avoided the square. She walked the fountain each morning with Clara wrapped against her, not to show, not to defy, but simply because it felt right. The water ran clear and cold, and she often sat beside it while the child dozed. Once, she dipped her fingers into the basin and touched them to Clara's forehead, as if in blessing. "You came from here," she whispered, "but you are not water. You are mine." And for the first time in her life, the words felt not like a prayer but a truth. She began to barter what little she had. An old lace shawl for firewood, her mother's copper basin for flour. The neighbors gave little, But enough. Clara grew heavier in her arms, her cheeks rounding, her hands grasping at Miriam's fingers with surprising strength. Each night, Miriam tucked the child beneath the patchwork quilt, now nearly finished, and watched her sleep with a mixture of wonder and dread. She did not know how long this could last. She did not know if someone would come looking, if the ring would be recognized, if the law would intrude on what the fountain had offered. But for now, in the hush of each evening, with the fire low and the child breathing slow beside her, Miriam let herself believe in the smallest of salvations, not redemption, not absolution, but the fragile beginning of a life she had never expected to have again. A life shaped not by grief, but by the steady, ordinary work of keeping a child warm, of feeding, of mending, of watching. A life lit not by grand gestures, but by the quiet whisper of milk and firewood. The sound of winter was different in the village than it had been in the cities Miriam had once passed through. Quieter, but not silent. It was a hush that lived under every roof tile and coiled itself into the eaves, a kind of listening cold that watched rather than touched. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, and the fields around the village, long harvested and shorn to stubble, glistened faintly with morning frost. Miriam had begun to move with winter's pace, rising early to feed the fire, bundling Clara in layers of flannel and wool before stepping outside to gather what little could be gleaned from the edge of the woods. Her days narrowed to essentials: warmth, food, stillness, breath. Each task centered around the child, who now reached for her with more certainty, her hands grasping Miriam's fingers as though they were handles on the edge of the world. Word of the baby had stopped moving like rumor and settled into something quieter, something that hummed beneath the village's everyday gestures. The stares had not ceased, but they no longer came with the sharpness of disbelief. Instead, there was something else in them now, an unsettled watchfulness, a cautious kind of waiting. The story of the baby from the fountain had no author, and the absence of explanation made it feel holy or dangerous, depending on who whispered it. Miriam did not explain, nor did she defend. She merely carried Clara with the silent devotion of someone who had already made peace with not being believed. The knock at the door came on the coldest morning yet, when frost feathered the inside of the window panes, and Clara's breath rose like smoke in the cradle Miriam had fashioned from a basket and a pair of old broom handles. It was a steady knock, neither urgent nor polite, but measured, as though the knocker had no doubt the door would open. Miriam laid her stitching aside and crossed the room, wrapping her shawl tight across her chest before lifting the latch. Betch stood in the doorway, hunched against the cold but unbothered by it. She had not come empty-handed. In one arm, she held a bundle wrapped in rough linen. In the other, her ever-present satchel, swollen at the seams with whatever tools a midwife might carry, things Miriam did not ask about. Her face was marked by years of wind and worry, her eyes dark hollows in the winter light, but sharp, always sharp, like a needle's point. "Let me see the child," she said without preamble. Miriam stepped aside. She had no reason to say no. Bedge had already seen Clara once, but that visit had felt more like a judgment than a kindness. Now, the old woman moved with a different weight. She did not glance around the room, did not linger on the threadbare state of things. She moved straight to the cradle, set the bundle she carried beside it, and looked down. Clara blinked up at her, half asleep, her cheeks flushed with warmth from the wool Miriam had tucked around her. Betch leaned down, touched the back of her hand to the baby's forehead, then pressed two fingers gently beneath her jaw. She watched the baby's breathing, lifted one arm, then the other, checked her spine and legs and eyes with the care of someone who had done this hundreds of times but never allowed the familiarity to dull her attention. Miriam stood nearby, her hands knotted in her apron, saying nothing. "She's strong," Betch said finally. "Not many would be, after a journey like hers. She doesn't cry much," Miriam offered softly, unsure if that was a virtue or concern. Betch nodded, her gaze still fixed on the baby. "Some are born that way, watching, waiting, like they've come through something already." She straightened, the joints in her knees cracking audibly, and moved toward the table. From the bundle, she unwrapped 3 small jars, one of thick salve, another dried lavender, and the last of fennel, and something sharp Miriam couldn't identify. "For the child," Betch said. "For her belly, her sleep, the salve for you. The cold's eating into your hands." Miriam blinked, then whispered a thank you. Betch didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced toward the mantel, where the silver ring still rested in the small porcelain dish that had once held Miriam's wedding bands. The old woman's gaze lingered there. "You haven't hidden it," she said. Miriam shook her head. "I don't know what it means." Betch stepped closer, her voice low, not urgent, but edged with something weightier than casual speech. "Silver rings are not given to infants without reason. That one's old, older than me. You see the marks?" Miriam had etchings along the band, so fine they seemed more like wear at first glance. "Do you know what they mean?" "No," Betch admitted, "but I've seen rings like that once before. A long time ago. From families who don't bury their dead in village soil, who take their griefs upriver, where the names are never spoken aloud." Miriam felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "Then she's not from here." Betch looked at her then, hard and unblinking. "She is now." The words sank into the air like embers falling into water. Miriam nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. She did not need the truth to know what was already real. Clara had not come to her by mistake. Whatever path had brought her down that stream, she had arrived in Miriam's arms as if pulled by something older than chance. Betch did not linger much longer. She gave a few instructions: how to brew the fennel for colic, how to warm the salve before use, and then she left, the cold closing behind her like a door within a door. Miriam stood for a long time, looking down at the jars, then at Clara, then at the ring. That night, she pressed the child to her chest and whispered the story she had never been able to tell. She spoke of Annalise, of the tiny shoe buried beneath the yew tree behind the church, of the blood that would not stop and the silence that followed. She spoke of Elias, of his quiet kindness and his greater absence, of the rooms in their home that had stayed empty because she could never bring herself to try again. She spoke of how grief had hollowed her, made her careful and invisible, how she had lived for years inside her own body like a house with all its windows shut. And then she said the name again, Clara, and again, until it felt like breath itself. In the weeks that followed, the air turned colder and the snow came in small, delicate flurries that never stayed long. Miriam began to carry Clara wrapped in furs she'd found in the back of the old wardrobe, her boots crunching over the frost-hardened paths as she walked from the cottage to the square and back again. She no longer avoided the gaze of others, though she still did not speak unless spoken to. The villagers continued to watch, but they also began to adjust. The baker gave her an extra loaf one morning, pretending it was too stale to sell. The girl who sold milk began to leave a small jar by the fountain every third day, as though by accident. The child grew. Her eyes followed the firelight now. She laughed, soft and sudden, like rain on leaves. Miriam stitched her name into more cloth, into the quilt, the corner of a shawl, the edge of the baby's bonnet. She never asked aloud if anyone was searching for her. She didn't want to know. The ring remained on the mantel, untouched, gleaming faintly in the firelight, a relic of a story that had not yet been told. One morning, Miriam went to the square and found a note pinned to the post beside the well. It was unsigned, written in a careful hand, and it read, asterisk, "The river gives what it will. Protect what it leaves behind." Asterisk, she looked around, but no one was near. The wind blew softly through the trees. She took the note home and placed it beneath the jar that held the fennel. She did not speak of it, but from that day on, she began to believe that she was not entirely alone in her understanding. The midwife came twice more before the deep winter. Each time, she brought something small, linen, dried sage, a carved rattle made from ash wood. She never asked questions. Miriam never offered answers. They shared tea once in silence while Clara slept between them. When Betch left for the last time that season, she placed a hand on Miriam's shoulder, firm and brief. "She is yours," the old woman said, however she came. Miriam closed the door behind her and leaned against it, the warmth of that simple truth blooming inside her like a late flower, stubborn and quiet and irrevocable. In the weeks that followed, snow fell heavier, gathering on the rooftops and blanketing the roads. The world shrank to the size of the cottage, the cradle, the fire. But inside those walls, The world had never been larger. Clara began to reach for the world with her fingers, and Miriam, for the first time in years, let herself be held. The fever came without warning. One day, Clara was reaching for the steam curling from the kettle. Her tiny fingers splayed wide in wonder as if she could catch it like a strand of wool. The next, her skin was flushed and hot to the touch, her cries hoarse and uncertain. Her body limp in Miriam's arms like the stem of a flower too long in the sun. It began with a cough, small and sharp but insistent. And by evening, Clara could not keep down milk. Her breath turned shallow, her eyes glassy, and her little hands, one so full of movement, lay still against Miriam's chest. Panic came fast, a low tide that dragged Miriam's thoughts into chaos. But she did not scream, did not run. Instead, she moved as if inside a dream, her hands certain even as her heart stumbled. She carried Clara to the hearth and placed her on the patchwork quilt, the one stitch from memory and sorrow, from dresses that no longer fit and curtains long taken down. She lit 2 lamps, one on each side of the cradle, and began to boil water. The herbs Betch had left, fennel, lavender, horehound, were measured and steeped, though Miriam had no real knowledge of which were meant for fever. She crushed garlic in a mortar, recalled a vague memory of her mother using it for sickness, though the details blurred with the passing of years. Cloths were soaked and wrung and placed on Clara's forehead, but the child did not stir. Her breath rattled in her chest like wind through dry leaves, thin and unreliable. Outside, the snow had come again, heavier than before, pressing against the windows and muting the sounds of the world beyond the walls. Miriam listened for footsteps, for knocks, for some sign the help might arrive without her having to leave the child's side. None came. The village, ever watchful but unwilling to touch what it did not understand, remained silent. She knew she could go to Betch, that she could wrap Clara in blankets and run to the edge of the square, pound on the midwife's door until the old woman answered. But she couldn't bring herself to move. It wasn't fear that held her. It was something deeper, an almost primal refusal to let the child out of her arms, as if the cold between her body and the world would only widen if she tried to bridge it. For 3 nights, Miriam did not sleep. She sat beside the fire, rocking Clara gently, whispering lullabies with cracked lips, her voice low and trembling. The fever did not break. Miriam's own body began to weaken, her back knotted, her throat raw, her eyes blurred from lack of rest. She tried to feed Clara spoonfuls of broth, but most of it ran down the sides of her mouth, pooling at her chin. The silver ring, still resting in its dish on the mantel, caught the firelight again and again, flickering like an accusation. She had not touched it since the night she found Clara, but now her eyes returned to it with a mounting urgency. The etchings along its surface, once unreadable, seemed to shift in the light, not clearer, but somehow closer, as though the ring itself was listening. On the 4th evening, with the fire dim and her strength nearly gone, Miriam rose from her chair with Clara swaddled in her arms and stepped out into the snow. The wind cut through her shawl like teeth, but she did not flinch. Her boots cracked through the icy crust as she moved down the path, past a gate, through the sleeping village. No one stirred. Curtains remained drawn. Doors stayed closed. It was as though the world had folded in on itself, unwilling to open again. She walked to the fountain. The water was not frozen. It never had been, not in the deepest winters, not in the years of drought or plague. It gurgled quietly beneath the falling snow, unfazed by the season. Miriam stepped onto the stone rim and knelt, her knees soaking through as the cold bit into her skin. Clara whimpered once, so faintly it might have been memory. Miriam pressed her lips to the child's forehead and then, with slow hands, unwound the twine that still bound the silver ring and tucked it between her fingers. She held it over the water. Her voice broke as she spoke, not loudly, but with the solemnity of someone speaking into the mouth of the earth itself. She came from you. I don't know what you are, what you remember, what you keep, but she came from your hands, and now she is slipping away. If I was meant to find her, then let her stay. If I was not, then take me instead. But do not take her. She placed the ring in the water. The current took it at once. It vanished into the basin's center, without a sound. Miriam waited. Snow fell into her hair, gathered in the folds of her sleeves. The fountain whispered on, unchanged. Nothing stirred. She remained there until her knees burned from the cold, until the child's breath grew even fainter. Then, with numb fingers, she stood and turned toward home, cradling Clara close. When she reached the gate, something lay on the post. It was a shawl, folded with care, thick and lined with lamb's wool, dry despite the snow. There were no footprints leading to it, no sign of who might have come or when. She took it in silence and wrapped Clara in it without questioning. The warmth of it was immediate, uncanny. Clara's eyes fluttered open once, and her mouth parted, not in a cry, but in a sigh, long and shuddering. Her breath steadied. That night, Miriam did not sleep, but she allowed herself to rest, Clara wrapped in the mysterious shawl, her body tucked into the curve of Miriam's arm. The fire burned low. The wind passed along the roof without malice. And when dawn came, pale and thin but real, Clara was still breathing. By midday, the fever broke. The flush drained from her cheeks. The sweat cooled her brow, and she turned her head against Miriam's shoulder, sucking softly on her thumb. The sound of it, gentle, rhythmic, alive, brought Miriam to her knees beside the cradle. She buried her face in quilt and wept, not like a storm, but like thaw. Long, slow, relentless. She never found the ring again. She searched the fountain for days, combing the edges with her fingers, peering into the current for a glimpse of silver. But it was gone. In its place, she began to notice other things. A sprig of rosemary tied with red thread on the doorstep. A bundle of dry twigs shaped into a charm, left hanging from the gate. Once, a loaf of bread, still warm. The gifts were always small, always silent. Miriam did not ask. She did not try to discover who left them. She only received them, with the same reverence she used to receive the sound of Clara's breathing. The shawl became a fixture, folded and placed in the cradle each night, a kind of unspoken pact. Miriam never wore it herself, though its softness called to her. It belonged to the child now. She believed, in some deep place, that it had always belonged to her. As Clara grew stronger, her gaze sharpened. She began to follow Miriam around the room with her eyes, turning her head slowly to track her movement, smiling when she caught her face. She made sounds now, gurgles, exclamations, little gasps of delight. The flush returned to her cheeks, and the roundness of her limbs grew day by day. She reached for the world with certainty. And Miriam, once uncertain of her own place in it, began to believe that the child had not come to be saved, but to show her what was still worth holding on to. That spring, when the last of the snow melted from the hills and the earth turned soft beneath the feet, Miriam planted violets in the garden her mother had once tended. She worked the soil with her hands. Clara tucked in a sling against her chest. The child laughed when dirt brushed her cheek, and Miriam pressed a kiss to her forehead. At the edge of the garden, beneath the window, she placed a stone. Upon it, she carved one word with the tip of her knife, Clara, not to mark a grave, but a beginning, a name claimed not by birth or law or blood, but by love, by trial, by the quiet defiance of a woman who had once believed her days of motherhood buried beneath the weight of loss. From that day forward, the fountain never felt like a place of sorrow. Miriam still visited, still sat beside its waters in the quiet hours before dawn, but now she did not whisper names into its depths. She simply listened, and sometimes in the hush between birdsong and breeze, she thought she heard something listening back. By the time the thaw truly came, it crept into the village like an apology, soft and slow, the kind that asked forgiveness before it dared to bloom. The snows retreated from the hills in hesitant streaks, revealing brown grass matted against the earth. Brittle twigs curled like fists beneath the hedgerows, and patches of soil that sighed when touched. The roofs of the cottages let go of their frost, and the icicles that had once hung like silent warnings now dripped steadily, marking time and water. Miriam stood at the edge of her garden, Clara cradled on her hip, watching the earth darken with readiness. The violets had survived. Their leaves were small still, but green, stubborn, trembling toward light. It felt like a small miracle that anything had made it through. Clara had grown in ways Miriam could barely track. Her limbs were longer now, her eyes sharper, always watching, always reaching. She had learned to sit upright on her own, her back straight as a reed, her hands busy with anything within reach. The child's laughter came easily now, a clear and unguarded sound, startling in its brightness. Sometimes it rang out suddenly in the cottage, when Miriam least expected it, as though Clara were speaking to someone Miriam could not see. At first she had found it unsettling, but over time it became familiar, even comforting. The child knew joy in a way that seemed untouched by fear. On a mild afternoon, as Clara napped with one hand curled around a strip of linen that once belonged to the hem of Miriam's wedding dress, a knock came at the door, not loud, but firm, official in a way Miriam recognized before she rose from the hearth. She had known it would come eventually, though she had allowed herself to hope the village might continue to look away. She smoothed her skirt with cold hands and opened the door. The priest stood on her threshold, a leather-bound book clutched beneath his arm, and his lips pressed into a thin line of civility. He was not an unkind man, nor was he cruel. He was simply a man who believed in order and record, in names placed where they belonged, in the ledgers that marked birth and death, sin and sacrament. Miriam inclined her head in greeting, but did not invite him in. "I've come," he said after a pause, "because the time has come to set things in place. The child, she must be entered into the registry." Miriam said nothing for a moment. She looked back toward the cradle where Clara slept, her breath slow and steady, the patchwork quilt tucked around her like a field of memory. "She has no surname," Miriam said quietly. The priest's brow furrowed, but only slightly. "Then we must choose one. The record cannot remain blank. You understand that. A child must belong to something." She almost smiled at that, the irony of it. That belonging could be decided by ink. That names in books could grant a child what the world would not. She stepped aside without a word and gestured for him to enter. The priest removed his hat and crossed the threshold, eyes scanning the small room with a kind of patient curiosity. He did not look directly at Clara, but acknowledged her presence with a slight nod. He placed a ledger on the table and opened it carefully. The pages were thick, yellow to the edges, filled with line upon line of names, generations of villagers, each entry a beginning or an ending. He uncapped his pen and waited. "She was found," Miriam said slowly, "by the fountain, the morning after the first frost lifted." He nodded once, pen poised. "She must have a name. And the mother?" "I don't know who her mother is," Miriam said, her voice firm now, low but unshaking. There was no note, no voice calling after, just the water. "And her." The priest hesitated. "You've chosen to keep her?" Miriam met his gaze fully for the first time. "She chose me." That seemed to give him pause. Though he said nothing, the pen hovered. "Her name is Clara," Miriam continued, crossing her arms slowly, as if bracing herself against something invisible. "Just Clara. No family name. Not from me. Not from anyone." The priest looked at her, lips pursed, then glanced down at the page. "There must be something, a mark of origin. A surname is more than custom. It protects. It connects." "She isn't yours to connect," Miriam said, and she felt her voice crack slightly, not with weakness, but with depth, like a tree splitting beneath the weight of its own roots. "She is here. She breathes. She laughs. That is all I can give you, and all I will." The priest studied her for a long time. In the silence, the wind pressed against the shutters, and the sound of Clara's breath rose above it. Fragile, steady, real. At last, he dipped his pen and wrote something. Miriam did not ask what he wrote. She would not have answered, even if she had. When he finished, he closed the ledger, fastened the strap, and gathered it under his arm once more. As he moved toward the door, he paused. "You should baptize her." Miriam shook her head. She was already chosen by something older. He did not argue. He only nodded once, then stepped back into the chill and left without another word. That night, after Clara had been tucked beneath the quilt and the fire began to die into coals, Miriam walked outside to the back of the cottage. The garden slept in the darkness. The violets curled inward against the cold. She stepped beneath the old oak tree that stood behind the house, the one her father had planted when she was born, the one that had never borne fruit but grew taller each year nonetheless. She placed her hand against its trunk, rough and steady beneath her palm, and took a slow breath. With her other hand, she drew out a small knife, the same one she'd used to carve Clara's name into the garden stone, and knelt in the bark of the tree, low enough to be hidden by overgrowth and shade. She carved one word, Clara, and beneath it, without hesitation, she carved her own. It was not a registry. It was not a baptism. It was not a contract. But it was binding. The next morning, Miriam found something new on the step. A length of blue ribbon, coiled like a question mark, heavy silk. Worn but clean. No note, no sign of who had left it. She lifted it slowly and ran it through her fingers. Then she went inside and tied it into Clara's cradle, a small flag of color among the faded patchwork. The ribbon became a symbol in the days that followed, woven into the child's hair as she grew longer curls, braided into her dress hems, sometimes even wrapped around Miriam's wrist like a thread between them. The village never asked about it, and Miriam never explained. The ledger might have recorded a line, but the blue ribbon carried something older, something that ink could never hold. Later that week, Betch came again, though she did not knock. She stood by the garden wall as Miriam hung linens to dry, her presence quiet but unmistakable. Clara was nearby, sitting on a folded quilt, her hands busy with a wooden spoon. When Betch spoke, her voice was low, almost a murmur. They wanted to assign her a surname. Miriam did not look up. They did. Betch nodded. I saw the entry. They wrote Clara of the Fountain. Something in Miriam's chest shifted. It wasn't pain, but it was close. Not sharp, but wide. She turned then, slowly, and looked at the old woman. Will that be enough? For some, Betch said. For others, too much. They said nothing more. Betch left the way she'd come, leaving behind a bundle of dried sage and a small bar of soap that smelled faintly of juniper. Miriam carried Clara inside and, for the first time, spoke the name aloud in full. Clara the Fountain, she said, lifting her into the air as the child laughed. Daughter of the water and of me. And the name settled not like a burden, but like a truth finally spoken. A name not from blood or lineage, but from story, from place, from miracle. A name rooted not in what had come before, but in what she had survived, what they both had. A name that belonged to no one, and yet to everything. A name born from water, but carried by fire. Clara the Fountain. And always, always Miriam's own. The first time she saw him, it was not the sight of him that made her stop, but the sound. A stone skipping across water, slow and deliberate. The sharp pause between one splash and the next. Miriam had come down to the riverbank with Clara strapped to her back, as she often did when the light was kind and the world felt less intrusive. The banks had softened with spring, the ice melt rushing through the reeds and tugging at their roots, swollen with memory. She walked there to gather herbs that would soon come into season, to collect dry reeds for basket weaving, and to let Clara listen to the water as though it could teach her the things Miriam could not. But that morning, she heard the stone before she saw the man, and the rhythm of it was not careless, not playful, but steady, one movement at a time, like someone counting the spaces between regrets. He was seated on a low outcropping of rock, his coat patched at the elbows, one leg stretched out straight, and the other bent beneath him in a way that seemed born more of habit than comfort. His hair was the color of bark after rain, and his face was turned slightly away from her, not in avoidance, but in the kind of quiet that precedes speech. When he turned, it was not sudden. He looked up slowly, as though he'd already sensed her there, as though he were used to being observed but rarely spoken to. His eyes met hers and held. They were pale, not the pale of illness or distance, but the pale of something exposed to too much sun, too much weather, too much waiting. She didn't speak, nor did he. He lifted another stone from the pile beside him, ran his thumb over its smooth curve, and tossed it into the water with the same measured motion. It hit the surface with sound like breath, let out slowly, skipped twice, then vanished. Clara shifted against her back, murmuring a drowsy hum, and the man's eyes dropped briefly to the child before returning to Miriam's face. He gave a small nod. That was all. A greeting stripped of language. She returned it, equally quiet, then turned and continued walking, unsure why her feet were slower now, as though something in her had changed direction without her consent. She did not tell anyone about the man. There was no reason to. He had said nothing, done nothing. But the next morning, he was there again. And the next, always seated in the same place, always with pocketful of stones, always skipping them with that same deliberate rhythm. The river, wide and restless, lapped at the edge of the bank, and he seemed unbothered by the damp, by the cold that still lingered beneath the spring air. After a week, Miriam began to expect him. She would pack a piece of bread in her apron and walk the river path not out of necessity, but out of a pull she could not quite name. The first words came without warning. It was late in the morning, the sun thick in the trees, Clara giggling as she tried to catch the dappled light between her fingers. Miriam had knelt to gather a patch of young yarrow, and when she straightened, the man spoke, his voice low and textured, like wood rubbed with oil. She laughs like someone who doesn't remember the cold. Miriam turned to look at him. He wasn't smiling, but there was warmth behind the words. Not familiarity. Not yet, but recognition. She doesn't, Miriam replied. She's only known warmth. That's good, he said. Some don't get that. They fell into silence again. The stones tapped against the surface of the river, each one marking time in a way that felt more honest than clocks. She wanted to ask him who he was, where he had come from, why he sat alone by the water each morning like a sentry with no post. But she didn't. She sensed that if she asked too soon, the answer would fold in on itself like a frightened animal. So she let it be. Over the following weeks, their meetings continued. Never planned, never named. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. He would offer a comment about the wind or the river or the way Clara clapped when the ducks appeared. And Miriam would answer, if she felt moved to. She learned to watch his hands. They were rough, callous, but careful. He handled the stones as though they mattered, as though the choice of each one carried weight. He walked with a limp, barely noticeable until he stood, and when he moved, it was with the kind of awareness that comes from pain learned long ago and never quite outgrown. One afternoon, she asked his name. It was early summer then, the grass long and feathered. Clara toddling now, her steps uncertain but persistent. They sat on opposite sides of the river's bend, the water between them narrowing, shallow enough to speak across without raising their voices. He paused mid-motion, stone in hand, then turned at once his palm before answering. Jacob, he said simply. She nodded. Miriam. He smiled, the first time she had seen it. It changed his face entirely, made him look younger and older all at once. Jacob began to carve. She noticed it one day when he wasn't skipping stones. Instead, he sat with a block of wood balanced against his thigh, a knife working slow arcs into the grain. He did not hide it, nor did he display it. It was simply what his hands did when they were not throwing. She watched him shape a horse, then a bird, then a doll's face, all from the same pail wood he brought in a canvas sack. Eventually, he handed her one, a small horse, its legs thick, its mane carved with loving detail. For her, he said, meaning Clara. Miriam accepted it without a word. That night, she placed it on the mantel beside the silver ring, the two objects so different and yet bound by the same silence. Clara reached for the horse the next morning with delight, holding it by the neck, galloping along the edge of the table. Jacob never came to cottage, nor did Miriam invite him. Their world remained outside, among the reeds and river stones, where words were few and days stretched without needing names. Yet his presence seeped into her days. She found herself looking for smooth bits of wood, wondering if he might carve them. She thought about what herbs might ease the stiffness in his leg, though she never dared to offer them. And sometimes at night, she thought of the way his eyes softened when Clara laughed, and the way he listened when she spoke, as if her voice held something he'd been waiting to hear. One evening, Clara fell and scraped her knee. The wound was minor, but her cry was sharp, sudden, and full of fear. Miriam knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around the child, whispering reassurances even as her own heart quickened. She lifted Clara and rocked her, kissed the wound, and as she did, she looked toward the edge of the trees where she had grown used to seeing Jacob each evening, his shape barely distinguishable from his shadows. He was there, watching, Not moving forward, not intruding. Just there, a presence, a witness. That was when she realized he had been watching them all along, even before the stones, even before he made himself known. Not out of suspicion, but out of something slower, something steadier. A kind of waiting that had nothing to do with what he wanted and everything to do with what he hoped might remain. Miriam found herself humming more. Old songs she didn't know she remembered. Her fingers worked more quickly in the mornings, her eyes lingering longer on small, beautiful things. The way the sun hit the copper basin, the smell of drying herbs above the stove, the sound of Clara babbling to herself in a language all her own, the heaviness she had carried for so long, the quiet certainty that nothing good would stay, began to shift, not disappear, not fully, but move, like silt settling at the bottom of a clear stream. One day, Jacob handed her a small pouch, stitched unevenly from wax cloth. Inside was a carving, a figure of a woman, her arms open, her face rough but tender. Alongside it was a strip of paper, folded in quarters. On it, a single sentence, asterisk, some things return in pieces. But they return, asterisk. She did not cry, but she held the carving to her chest for a long time before placing it in the drawer, beside Clara's first booty, the letter she had never opened, and the pressed petals from her mother's wreath. She did not know what Jacob had lost. He never told her, but his silence was not emptiness. It was presence, and it taught her, without saying so, that sometimes love begins not with declarations, but with showing up each day beside the river, waiting to be needed, asking nothing but to remain close enough to listen. And so he did, and so she let him, not as a rescue, not as a replacement, but as a witness, one who knew how to stay. The storm rolled in without thunder, without warning, only a thick breath of wind that bent the tops of the trees and sent a tremor through the bones of the village. It was a kind of storm that whispered first, inverting the leaves and shifting the smell of the earth, carrying with a hush that made the world lean in. The animals knew it before the people did. The birds fell silent. The hens moved restlessly in their coops, and the dog belonging to the miller barked at nothing, and then hid beneath the porch without further protest. Miriam stood by the window that evening, Clara on her hip, and watched the sky roll inward. It wasn't yet dark, but the sun had been swallowed, leaving only a strange half-light that blurred the edges of everything outside. The trees beyond the garden twisted in the wind, their limbs moving like old women gathering shawls around their shoulders. She had already drawn the shutters tight, lit the hearth, and secured the cradle with a thick pillow to keep it from rocking. Clara, now nearly 2 years old, had grown sturdy on her legs, though her balance still wavered in the dark. She no longer needed to be carried always, but Miriam held her now with a quiet insistence, as if something beneath her skin had registered a change in the air. There were storms that passed through, and then there were storms that stayed, that rewrote something in the soil and left the world tilted just slightly off its axis. It was in the hours before night truly settled that Clara began to cry. Not in pain, not in hunger, but in the low, keening wail that Miriam had come to recognize as rooted in something deeper than discomfort. The child's face turned toward the window, her eyes wide and unblinking, her hands trembling not from cold, but from some unseen presence. Miriam pressed her lips to Clara's damp forehead and rocked her slowly, whispering songs in a voice hoarse from disuse. But the child would not settle. She twisted in Miriam's arms, pointing again and again toward the shuttered glass, her mouth shaping syllables that meant nothing and yet struck something true. Eventually, driven by an urgency she could not explain, Miriam unlatched the door and stepped out into the dark with Clara wrapped tightly to her chest. The wind caught her shawl and dragged it behind her like a trailing shadow, but she did not turn back. The rain had not yet begun, but the clouds pressed low enough to feel. She moved down the path with steady feet, past the garden where the violets had bloomed early and were now bowed with wind, past the gate Jacob had helped her mend last autumn, past the crooked fence post where Clara liked to sit and hum to the beetles in summer. The square was empty, save for the fountain, which stood as it always did, unchanged, unbothered, eternal. The water still moved, but more slowly, as if reluctant to ripple. Miriam stood before it, Clara restless against her shoulder, and waited. It was then she saw her. At first, Miriam thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection caught in the basin, a memory surfacing in the storm's half-glow. But the figure was there, real small and impossibly still. A girl, kneeling at the water's edge, her back to the wind, her hair falling in long, wet strands down the length of a pale cotton gown. She was not Clara, and yet there was something in the tilt of her head, the curve of her shoulders, the angle of her hands resting on her knees that felt known, familiar in the way dreams sometimes borrow from the shape of memory. Miriam did not call out. Her throat closed around her voice. She stepped forward, only once, and the girl turned her head slowly, just enough for her face to be visible beneath the fall of hair. Her features were delicate, unlined by time, and her eyes were dark and wide with something too deep for fear. She looked at Miriam as though she had been waiting to be seen. Not rescued, not claimed, just seen. Then the girl reached into the water and drew something from it, a small, damp object, rounded and pale. She stood, the movement graceful and slow, and placed the object on the stone edge of the fountain. She did not speak. She did not smile. She only turned and walked backward into the dark, vanishing without sound. Not into the village, not into the woods, into the water. And when the wind surged and cleared Miriam's vision, the girl was gone. Miriam stepped forward. Her breath caught tight in her ribs and looked down. It was a tiny knitted shoe, the very one she had buried with Annalise years ago, beneath the yew tree behind the church, in the hush of morning that had never fully ended. The wool was water-stained but intact, the bead at its toe still sewn on with gold thread. Its rattle silent now with damp. She knelt, the stone cold to her skirt, and picked it up with both hands. It was as light as she remembered, but it pulsed with something heavier, a weight of return, of witnessing, of things not lost but held until they could be returned without breaking. She held it to her chest, against Clara's small frame, and whispered both names into the storm. The one who had been taken too soon, and the one who had been given back in another form. She did not know who the girl had been. Not exactly. But in her bones she knew in the way that mothers know when their children wake before they cry, when their dreams are not yet spoken. Knew that the girl was Annalise, not as a ghost, not as a specter, but as a presence that had never truly departed. Something had crossed that night. Something had been bridged. Clara reached out then, her fingers brushing the shoe, and for the first time since the wind began, she smiled. Miriam returned to the cottage in silence, the shoe wrapped in the blue ribbon Jacob had given months ago. She did not speak of what she had seen. Not to Betch, who would have understood in ways that needed no telling. Not to Jacob, who saw the world through different lenses, but trusted what could not be named. Not even to Clara, who already carried the truth of it in her bones, in the way she slept that night without a single cry, curled like a comma in the space between loss and return. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the garden was wet with promise. Miriam placed a shoe on the mantel, beside the carved horse and the silver ring, and stared at the three objects in quiet reverence, each one a marker, a chapter, a wound. That day, Clara walked to the fountain by herself for the first time. Miriam followed at a distance, heart clutched in her throat, but she did not stop her. The child stood at the basin, reached into the water, and dipped her fingers as though greeting something familiar. Then she turned, walked back to Miriam, and said the word home with clarity that belied her age. Miriam wept again, not with fear this time, not with longing, but with awe, with the weight of having witnessed what few ever believed possible. Later that year, she carved a small plaque and nailed it beneath the eaves of the cottage. On it, just one word, Annalise. Beneath it, the date of her birth, and beneath that, a carving of two open hands. Not everyone asked what it meant. The ones who did were answered with silence or with tea. But the story sailed into the village like water into stone, not fast, not loud, but unmovable. And from that day forward, the fountain was no longer just a place where the past echoed. It was a place where it returned, not to haunt, not to hurt, but to touch what remained and remind it that it was still loved, still worthy, still part of the stream. There came a season, slow and golden, when everything seemed to hold its breath in gratitude. The heat of summer gave way to a gentler warmth, and the fields beyond the village softened into shades of wheat and bronze. The trees, still full, began to rustle with a new kind of sound, not just wind, but the quiet warning of leaves beginning to loosen. The light stretched longer in the afternoons and turned amber in the evenings, casting the cottage in a glow that made the shadows seem less sharp. It was during this season that a deeper rhythm began to settle into Miriam's days, one that moved with more than survival. It moved with purpose, with pattern, with the grace of something earned. Clara was 3 by then, her speech growing clearer, her limbs faster, her curiosity blooming like a wildflower in an untended field. She asked questions constantly about the stars, about the names of herbs, about the reason the rooster sometimes crowed at dusk instead of dawn. Miriam answered as best she could, and when she didn't know, she admitted it without shame. Clara accepted these silences as readily as she accepted knowledge, her trust absolute. She had no memory of being found, no concept of how she came to be Miriam's. Her world was shaped by the things that held her. Miriam's arms, the cradle Jacob had repaired, the wooden horse always nearby, and the fountain, which she visited nearly every day as if it were a relative whose voice she could almost hear. Jacob had become a part of their lives in ways both simple and profound. He came each week to bring what he could. What he had chopped and dried, game he had hunted and cleaned, things she hadn't asked for but no longer refused. He never stayed the night, though sometimes he lingered by the hearth after supper, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, his eyes soft with the comfort of presence. Clara adored him in the quiet, stubborn way children reserve for people they've chosen for themselves. She followed him outside, mimicking the way he carried tools, the way he tested a fence post, the way he folded his sleeves with a single movement. Miriam watched them together and felt something in her chest relax, like a door she had braced shut for years, now gently swinging open. But it wasn't a romance, not in the way stories are told. It was not born of stolen glances or breathless declarations. It was built instead from repetition, from shared silences, from the trust that forms when someone shows up again and again without asking for more than what is offered. Jacob never pressed for answers about the child or the night Miriam had come back from the square, soaked with rain and holding something not born of that night alone. He never asked about the silver ring, still kept in its dish, or the shoe on the mantle, or the name carved in wood beneath the eaves. He saw them all, and he let them be. One morning, Clara ran barefoot into the kitchen, holding a bundle of sticks tied with rough twine. Her cheeks were flushed, her curls sticking to her brow, and she was breathless with delight. "Firewood," she announced. "Jacob said it's a pact." Miriam smiled, turning from the stove where porridge simmered, and knelt beside her. "A pact?" Clara nodded solemnly. "He said if we use this to warm the house, we have to promise to keep it warm." Miriam lifted the bundle from her small arms and felt the smoothness of the sticks. Carefully split, clean, the bark stripped away with care. It was Jacob's work. She looked back at Clara and brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Then we'll make that promise," she said. Together, that night, as the fire crackled with Jacob's wood, and the 3 of them sat in the quiet of a long evening, Miriam thought about the word pact. Not contract, not duty. Something older, something chosen. She glanced at Jacob, who was carving another small animal, this one a fox with a curled tail, and then at Clara, who had fallen asleep beside the hearth with her head against Miriam's leg. She reached out and touched Jacob's hand. He paused, met her eyes, and she said simply, "Stay a little longer." He did. The days grew shorter, and with them came preparations. Miriam spent hours mending old blankets, laying dried herbs into cloth pouches to hang above the windows, and storing root vegetables in the cellar. Jacob brought apples by the bushel, which Clara helped press into jars. Their hands stained red with juice. She and Miriam boiled cider over the hearth and filled the cottage with a scent so thick it seemed to sink into the very walls. It was the first time in years that Miriam prepared for a season not with dread, but with anticipation. And yet, the past was not banished. It lived quietly among them, not as a threat, but as a memory that had finally settled. Sometimes Miriam caught herself watching Clara too closely in her sleep, counting the rise and fall of her chest, waiting for a sound that proved she was still there. Other times, She would touch the shoe on the mantle or turn the silver ring between her fingers and feel that peculiar ache of having lost and gained in unequal measure. On the first frost of that year, Miriam did something she had never done before. She took a piece of linen, pale and clean, and sat down at the table where she had once unpacked her grief in silence. With careful hands, she wrote her name beside Clara's in charcoal ink, not in a registry, not for law, but for legacy. She folded the cloth, wrapped it in wax paper, and buried it beneath the hearthstone Jacob had reset the previous winter. Not to hide it, to anchor it. That same evening, she told Jacob what she had always feared to speak aloud. About Annalise, about the first cry that never came, about the nights she spent speaking to an empty cradle. Jacob did not interrupt. He did not offer platitudes. He simply reached out and placed a carved bird into her hand, light and smooth, and whispered, "You still carry her. But now you don't have to carry her alone." She wept then, not as a collapse, but as a release. Later, after Clara was asleep and the fire had dimmed, Jacob placed his hand over hers again and asked, "Do you think she chose you, this child?" Miriam looked into the fire. "I think we chose each other." At the same moment, in the village, people still spoke in low tones when they passed Miriam and Clara in the square. They watched with a curiosity reserved for stories that live on the edge of belief. But the tone had shifted. There was no longer suspicion, only a kind of reverence. They brought baskets to the door, eggs, cloth, sometimes sweets for Clara. They did not ask for explanations. Miriam gave none. The village had learned to honor what could not be named. One day, while tending the garden together, Clara placed her hand in the dirt and whispered something under her breath. Miriam turned to ask what she'd said, but the child only smiled and replied, "I was saying thank you to the earth." Miriam asked gently, "To the water," Clara said, patting the soil. "It brought me home." Miriam didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later that season, Jacob built a bench beneath the old oak tree where Miriam had carved their names. He worked in silence for 2 days, using the same ash wood he had once used for Clara's cradle. When it was done, he didn't sign it. But when Miriam sat upon it that evening, the sun spilling gold through the branches, she saw a small carving tucked beneath the seat. 3 small figures, their hands joined. Not a replacement, not a rescue, a beginning, a pact fulfilled. The years passed in the way they always do in places where time is measured less by clocks and more by seasons. One winter melted into another, and with each spring the garden grew more stubborn, more willing. The violets came back year after year, spreading beyond their original patch to scatter under the fence posts and in the cracks of the stone path. Miriam grew older in the quiet way that women do when they've made peace with the softness of routine. Her hair turned silver at the temples, not all at once but in threads, and her hands, one stiff from grief, learned to move with patience again, slow and capable. She no longer rushed. The days did not demand it. Clara grew faster than Miriam could prepare for. It happened gradually and then all at once. Her legs lengthened, her voice deepened, her questions grew harder to answer. She ran through the field with her skirts bunched at the knees and her pockets full of small stones, feathers, and poems written in half-spelled words. She was a child of the land, of the stream, of the silence. Her curiosity remained, but it changed shape. She began to ask about what lay beyond the hills, what lived in the forest beyond the village, what happened in cities where people slept beneath roofs that scraped the sky. Miriam answered what she could and let the rest remain open, like a gate unlatched but not yet swung wide. The villagers no longer looked at Clara as they once had. Time had softened their curiosity into something like affection. She was still known as the girl of the fountain, the child the water had chosen, but the name no longer held suspicion. It carried wonder instead, as if some small magic had lived within the village walls all along, and no one had known how to name it until she arrived. She played with the miller's sons and helped the baker sort his deliveries each morning. She sat beside the midwife on market days, asking questions about herbs and births, learning to braid lavender into ropes to hang from rafters. She belonged, not because anyone had granted her the right, but because she had grown her roots so deep they could not be pulled. Jacob remained. He built his own small cottage not far from Miriam's, near the place where the river bent toward a grove of birch trees. He did not move in, nor did he ever make promises that sought to tame what they had. Their closeness was not named, only lived. He came when he was needed, stayed when it mattered, left when the work was done. On cold evenings, Miriam would see the glow of his fire from her window, and she would rest easier knowing someone else was awake in the same dark. Clara began to call him simply Jacob, but the way she said it carried something deeper, something that lived between names and roles. He was hers in a way that people are claimed by presence, not possession. On Clara's 7th birthday, the morning was still and clear. The sky stretched pale and endless above the cottage, and the frost had not yet broken, but the air carried the scent of something new. Miriam rose early and stoked the fire, warmed milk with honey, and set out the small gift she had prepared: a stitched shawl, a book of pressed flowers, and a ribbon the color of river water. The silver ring, cleaned and polished, rested in a small wooden box beside the plate of honey bread. When Clara came into the room, her hair wild from sleep, Miriam took her hand and led her to the bench beneath the oak tree, the one Jacob had carved years before. They sat in the hush of the morning, the trees motionless, the frost glinting like sugar on the ground. Miriam opened the box and lifted the ring by its ribbon. "This was on your wrist the day you came," she said. "You were quiet, watching, as if you'd been here once before." Clara touched the ring gently, her fingers deliberate. "Was I?" Miriam didn't answer right away. She looked out at the fountain in the distance, the way the water still rose and fell without end, the basin smooth from years of rain and time. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think you came back for me." Clara slipped the ribbon over her head and held the ring against her chest. "Does it mean I belong to the water?" "No," Miriam said. "It means you came from it, but you never belonged to the current. You were always meant to stay." Clara looked at her then, eyes so clear and steady, they seemed to hold the whole of the past in their gaze. "Like you." Miriam smiled. "Like me." That afternoon, the village gathered quietly in the square, not for a feast or a festival, but to mark the day in their own quiet way. Betch brought a bundle of dried lavender wrapped in lace. The baker made a pie with the last of the summer berries he had frozen in jars. Jacob carved a new stool and painted the legs in soft green. There were no speeches, no songs. Just the hum of life continued, a kind of reverence that did not need to be spoken. As evening fell, Clara ran down to the fountain, the ribbon glinting at her neck, her boots barely touching the stone as she moved. She knelt beside the basin, dipped her hand into the cold water, and whispered something that Miriam could not hear. She stayed that way for a long time, unmoving, her fingers tracing the patterns in the current. When she returned, she didn't speak. She simply wrapped her arms around Miriam's waist and leaned into her side, content. Years later, when Claire was grown and the world had begun to pull at her with questions and journeys of her own, she would return often to the fountain. She would sit beside it in the early morning or late dusk, listening to the water and remembering the story she had been born into, not by blood, not by name, but by choice and love and presence. Miriam would watch her from the window, her hands folded in her lap, her hair now fully white, her face lined with years well used. She no longer feared being forgotten. Legacy, she had learned, was not carved into stone or written into ledgers. It was passed through hands and glances, through the smell of cinnamon in the air, through the weight of a quilt stitched with care, through a child who knew how to listen to silence and feel safe inside it. On the last day of Miriam's life, Claire was beside her, her hand resting on the same quilt that had once wrapped her in infancy. The fire burned low. The wind whispered through the eaves. And as Miriam drew her final breath, there was no fear, only a stillness, so complete it felt like a return, not to water, not to grief, but to the warmth she had built from fragments. Clara lit a candle and placed it by the window. The next morning, she walked to the fountain. The village was quiet, the sky low with mist. Clara knelt, just as her mother once had, and placed a folded piece of linen into the water. On it were two names, stitched in thread the color of early spring. The current carried it gently across the surface, then drew it down without resistance. She rose, brushed her hands on her skirt, and turned toward home. Behind her, the fountain whispered on.